Hi everyone, my name is James Feeney. Welcome to or back to my channel. Today I want to conduct a tarot reading very much in the way that Aleister Crowley would. So I was recently rereading the Book of Thoth, as I tend to do, and anybody who's read it will probably know that there is a section where Crowley runs through the operations that he suggests when using the cards for divination. So he provides instructions on how he thinks a reading ought to be conducted. And I've seen, I think, a few things where others go through the operations, and I'm not sure if they are exactly the same as the way that Crowley's done it. I know I watched it one time on Benabel's channel, but I don't know if it was the same as the way Crowley instructs it. I know that there are a series of operations that are kind of known to a lesser or more degree, but I thought we would go through maybe following Crowley's instructions to a T in a reading, seeing how that all plays out, and then on top of that, I guess having a little bit more fun with it and not making it so serious. So Crowley actually has write-ups on all of the cards, of course, to let you know what his thoughts are and what the cards mean, but he has a little section on divinatory meanings, at least for the majors, that I find really funny. It's very Little White Book-esque, where he has a sort of poetic quote or a poetic verse where he speaks to the card and then his ideas of what it might mean in terms of divination. And so if we were to get any of those major arcana, some of those definitions or meanings as far as divination goes are pretty funny, and so I'd like to maybe use those when applicable. But yes, going through the operations, let's see. So they are listed. They're quite extensive, and this might turn out to be a bit longer or something bigger, taking off a little bit more than I can chew, but I'd like to try it. And there are stages where if certain things are not the case, he urges or asks the person conducting the reading to abandon it. So if certain things come up and you aren't correct in your intuitive guess on what something ought to be, then you are supposed to discontinue and abandon the reading altogether. I'm not sure that I will do that. I think I'll proceed regardless, just so we can get through all of it, and I think it'll be fun to get to the end stages. There's a lot of instructions, a lot of it connects to the astrological signs and the houses and the deacons and the Tree of Life. And so I think it'll be really fun to offer my own insights on that, get some of your opinions, and hear what you guys have to say in regards to these things. I've never fully done one of these. I think I've taken little bits from Crowley's style in readings for fun, but I've never gone through all of the operations. So without further ado, I think we're going to get over to a space where I can show the cards, and I think this will require a lot of space given how he instructs things to go, and we will do a reading like this. I think it'll be really fun. Alright everybody, so we're going to get right into how Crowley would conduct a reading. We're going to try to have some fun with this, but also stay as true as we can to what he speaks to here for the sake of just learning how it would be for him and kind of get ourselves in that time period, understand a little bit of tarot reading history in a way. So if you're looking to follow along, I recommend using a smaller deck. I'm using the trimmed version of my Thoth, just because the way that Crowley speaks to this type of reading going, it seems as though a lot of space is required, and so laying out a lot of cards, if they are big cards, is going to be a lot more difficult. So recommend a smaller deck. If you are using the Thoth deck or any other, try to go for a small one if you have it. Now, we first start with this intro to divination, almost like a warning and also a preface, and then we get right into the first thing we're supposed to do, which is the significator card and choosing of the significator card. Now, this is supposed to represent the querent or client or person getting the reading, a card that speaks to their character. Crowley doesn't have an exact method for ascertaining this, but he says to go based on one's character rather than physical appearance. And so that's what we're going to do. In the way that I've learned to do it or come to do it is more through astrology. So I would go based on my sun sign and the deacon of the court card that oversees the deacon of my sun sign. So in Thoth you have the princes, the queens, and the knights, all ruling over 3 deacons, 2 of one sign, 1 of another. So you could go about it that way. You might pick a card that just feels like it represents you. You could go with a major arcana or a court card. I'm going to go with the Knight of Wands because I was born in the 2nd decan of Sagittarius, and so this would be the ruling court card, or the court card that is attributed to that. So this would be my significator card. Now you're not going to take this out of the deck because we're going to get into the first actual part of the reading, which is the first operation. This would be where we shuffle up the deck and then find the court card after we cut the deck into 4 piles. So we're going to do that. Shuffle it on up. All right, so that should be good. Now for this first operation and the cutting of the deck into these 4 piles, they're going to create the IHVH. If you're not familiar with the Thoth, these are basically signifying the elements or the suits. I mean, they mean more than that, but for the purposes of this reading, they are basically speaking to areas of life that are depicted by the various suits or elements. And so he says to take the 1 pile, to cut it into 2, and then to take each of the piles and create another pile, going leftwards. So this is going to be, we went to the left with this one, we create another pile, going to the left, going to the left. So these speak to the suits being the wands, the cups, the swords, and the discs or pentacles. So this, Crowley says, for the fire pile or the wands, speaks to business, work, etc. We then have marriage and love for water or the cups. We have scandal, loss, and basically all of the tragic things allocated to the sword or air pile. And then we get material matters, finances, money, all over in the earth or pentacle or disc pile. So that is how Crowley sees it. Now we would go through these piles and find the significator card, and that's going to tell us what it is that the querent or client has come for a reading about. Now, the way Crowley speaks to this is that the person doing the reading should tell the client or querent what they've come to the reading for, and if they're wrong, you are to abandon the reading and stop and not go forward. Now, we're going to go forward regardless, and I don't have anything in mind in terms of this reading, so it'll just be for fun. But it's interesting that Crowley thinks that divination in such a serious way that he would stop a reading if that were the case. And also it seems as though a querent or client needs to have a reason for a reading. They need to have a matter at hand or an area of life or a question to delve into. You wouldn't get a reading just for reading's sake. That wouldn't be good enough of a reason to consult the cards just for fun or just out of interest. There's also the idea that one has to get a reading from somebody else. He doesn't really account for, it seems, the idea of conducting a reading on yourself. So all of that to me is very interesting. Now we're going to dig into these piles, find the Knight of Wands, and when you find your significator card, it's important to keep it in the pile where it is. So as we go through trying to find the Knight of Wands, when you find your significator card, don't remove it and don't change its position in the pile. That's going to be important for the next portion of the reading. So just make sure you leave it where it is. So we found him here in this pile, the water pile, love, marriage, those sorts of things, emotions. And so we're going to leave the Knight of Wands right where it is. So of course we found the significator. We're going to assume that it was in the proper place in considering what I may have come for a reading for. Now, if you're right, spread out the pack containing the significator face upwards. So we'll set these other piles aside for now as best we can. So we're going to take the cards face up now and counting the cards. If right, spread out the cards of the pack containing the significator face upward. Count the cards from him in the direction in which he faces. Counting should include the card from which you count. So basically you would start face up where your significator is, and there are numbers that let you know how you would count. So we could almost make it into a circle. Here, I'm going to just make this into a bit of a circle so that you can see, and I'll be right back. It's also important to keep the ordering of the cards as they are, so make sure they stay in order as you create this circle. Okay, so remember what I said about creating and having a lot of space and using a small deck, yes, very important for this, because I had to not only just create a circle and I tried to keep it in the frame, but then it kind of became a bit of a spiral, and so there's a little bit of a second layer to this. It's more of a spiral than a circle, but it's just important that you can kind of understand where each card is if you were to count, to know how it would go. You know what I mean? So you want to be able to know this is say the first card I put down, and this was at the top of that pack, and then this, the temperance or art card, was at the bottom, and this is where our significator is. That's really where we're starting, is with the significator, who is situated up here. And so for the sake of this reading, we're going to start counting, and we count based on which way the court card is facing. So because the Knight of Wands is facing left, we're going to count counterclockwise rather than clockwise. So keep that in mind. Crowley anticipates that one will use a court card for their significator, so depending on if it's facing right or left, you would count in that direction. Now, you would count based on the number associated with the card. So for knights, queens, and princes, you count 4. For princesses, count 7. For aces, count 11. For small cards, count according to the number. So for 2s through 10s, you would count just based on what the number of the card is. And then for the trumps, you would do 3 for the elemental trumps, 9 for the planetary trumps, and 12 for the zodiacal trumps. So if it's related to a sign, then of course you would count 12 spaces. If it's an elemental like the Fool or the Aeon or Judgment card, something like that, or the Hanged Man, then you would go 3. And if it were for a planetary trump, say like the Tower, Mars, is associated with Mars, you would go 9. And we have, of course, the World card playing double duty, but I'm pretty sure you would just go with the fact that it's more of a planetary trump, because of the fact that he says 3 for elemental trumps. There are only 3 purely elemental trumps. Now, because of the fact that I'm using the Knight of Wands, as my significator, and he is facing left, we're going to count 4 spaces to the left, and that's going to get us to 1. Wait, do we count the knight? Count the cards from him in the direction they face. So we're not going to include the card that we start with. So this is not 1. We start with the card next to it. 1, 2, 3. And then the next card, if we were making a circle, would actually be up here in the spiral. So it's actually the temperance card or the art card. And so you want to remember what that is. Maybe move it up a little bit or out of place so that you know, or you could even just flip it over so that way you know it's going to be a part of what's going on and that it's off limits, so to speak. And that's going to be important because you're going to keep counting the cards and keep going counterclockwise and picking cards out until you hit a card twice. So let's see, let's just make sure. Make a story of these cards. This story is that of the beginning affair. So this is supposed to be almost like a narrative for the querent or client in a reading. This is going to be a story. Pair the cards on either side of the significator. So if you wanted to, you could make a very long line instead of a circle, and that might make it easier to let you know where they sit on the left or the right of your significator card. If this story is not quite accurate, don't be discouraged. Perhaps the querent himself does not know everything, but the main lines ought to be laid down firmly with correctness or the divination should be abandoned. So he says to basically be as confident as you can be in the story, regardless of if it makes sense or not. And that if it doesn't make sense, maybe it's because the person getting the reading doesn't know themselves or their situation well enough. So the way that I've learned to do this, and it doesn't specifically say, is to continue to count the cards until you hit on a card twice. And so say I hit back on the art or temperance card again as I go through. So I would keep going around, counting the cards until I hit a card twice. And then that would be the finishing point for that. So because we just hit a zodiacal trump, the art card, we're going to now go 12 spaces to the left. And so we would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And so this would be our our Prince of Discs. So we're going to flip him over just so we know he's a part of the reading. Because he's a prince, we go 4 spots. 1, 2, 3, 4. The World card. Now this is a planetary trump, so we would go 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The Ace of Swords, so 11. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Now we have the Knight of Swords, so we would go 4 spots. 1, 2, 3, 4. The Two of Swords, so we would go 2 spots. 1, 2. Now we've hit back on the Art or Temperance card, so this is going to let us know that it's time to stop because we've hit on a card that we already turned over or found to be part of the reading, so that's when we would stop this operation. Now, Crowley instructs to lay them out on the sides of in the way that they would if they were all laid out in a straight line. So how that would work here is that we would have go through and we're creating this story. So we have and we'll move these out of our way a bit. And so this is supposed to create a narrative. We start with the Two of Swords, then we have our Knight of Wands, the World, the Knight of Swords, the Prince of Discs, the Ace of Swords, and then Art or Temperance at the culmination. So in that, this was a part of that watery pile or the second pile for marriage and love. We might think of being caught in between choices of the heart and mind and choosing maybe one person or another, or choosing one circumstance, choosing to enter a relationship or not, or feeling like you should leave or go or stay. So feelings of conflict in the past. This being potentially more of the present. Crowley says that this might not be exactly chronological, so this might not be just as the series of events progresses, so keep that in mind, but just for the sake of it, I'm coming up with a story. Then we have the World card here, so of course it makes me think that the choice that was made is going to amount to something great and was probably a beneficial choice for the querent or myself. Then we have this Knight of Swords, and this would probably be a swift outside force. It feels like maybe something disrupting what the World card represents, and maybe a need to get back to the basics and reground oneself and work from scratch after everything has maybe been thrown into disarray. We have the Ace of Swords, which feels like a bit of an aha or a eureka moment amidst this grounding and slowly working towards, and so having to have been deconstructed in some way, one might think that in this area of life, balance will be eventually acquired. So that's how we would go about that first operation in the first portion of the reading. So that was just a very quick speed through, but that's how Crowley would have us do it. Now we have the second operation. So we would go back, put all the cards back together again, shuffle, invoke suitably. So there is an invocation in the beginning, which we skipped. If you feel called to hold a wand over your deck and do this invocation, please feel free. I did not. So shuffle, invoke suitably, and let the querent cut as before. Deal the cards into 12 stacks for the 12 astrological houses of heaven. So instead of cutting into 4 piles, we're going to create 12 piles. Make up your mind, and this has to do with the houses. So if you know astrology, you know what each house entails. So the 12 houses will be outlined. Now, in the same way that one would know which pile, apparently, the significator would be in, you would have an idea of which house the area of life should be within. So examine the chosen stack, the one that you think the significator card ought to come up into, based on what the topic of the reading is. If it's not there, try a cognate house. On a second failure, abandon the divination. So you get 2 tries this time to try to find the significator card. So then basically the next most similar house in astrology, the one that it would be in most likely after the first one that you could think of, it would be in that one. And if it's not, you would then stop, because apparently you're not meant to know, or you're not on the ball enough to be able to find it correctly, so you would stop the reading. So we're going to go back and do that and find our significator card appropriately. Alright, so I have 12 piles here. I tried to fit it in the frame as best as possible. Crowley doesn't speak as much to how to cut the deck into the 12 piles in the same way. So, and it's kind of difficult to make 12 piles and like keep cards. That's very interesting. So I wish he almost would have included more on that. But we have 12. I started and kept going leftward as we did with the previous, and I just kind of spaced them. Now, based on what the reading is meant to be about in our narrative, I'm thinking it's either going to be the 5th house or the 7th house. That's just my findings. If you're out there and you like astrology and you're an astrology aficionado, I wouldn't say that I'm a pro, but I would say that I like to think I am, I don't know, proficient enough. So we're going to go for the 5th house. And so we don't see our Knight of Wands there. And then we would go for our 7th house here. And supposedly if he weren't here, we would give up. And we would abandon the divination, as Crowley says. Now, he's not here either. So that means we're going to go through and see what house our Knight of Wands is residing in right now. So he's in the 8th house, actually. Very interesting. One might not think that for love and marriage, supposedly, as Crowley puts it. But we're going to take this and then do the same thing. So we'll take all these cards, get them out of the way. And of course, we're not abandoning the divination as Crowley would. We want to go and see this through to the end. So this one will be a lot easier to create a sort of circle, given that there's not as many cards. So he's facing left as he was before. So we would go 1, 2, 3, 4. And so we see the 6 of Swords. Then we would go 6 spots. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The Death card, flip it. Death is a zodiacal trump, so we would go 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And so we would get the 4 of Wands, so 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And so then we have, over here, we have our Prince of Swords. So we would go 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then again, we have the Knight of Swords. And then we would go 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have the 6 of Discs. I believe, yes, right? Yes. And so, and the significator card doesn't count. He's automatically going to be included. So we've basically completed, we've gotten every card, and we never hit on one second time. So we are done. All of the cards that were in that pile are involved in the reading. So we can line them up as we did before. I believe that's what we're supposed to do. Let me double check. Okay, read the stack and count the pairing as before. So yes, you would create a sort of narrative, but keep the house in mind, because the house, now that we have just found our significator here, is of relevance. So if you're not an astrological aficionado, if you're not proficient in astrology, you might consult a book. I have a video on reference books, and if you're looking for a really great astrological reference book, my recommendation is this one. I just think it's my favorite reference book for astrology, and it's very comprehensive, so definitely recommend this. And if you know astrology, great, then you can consult. You don't have to consult anybody. You just go ahead and know that this house means a certain thing and create the story based on that. So I suppose that one might find this house to actually in some abstract way relate to relationships of a sort. It speaks to a lot of psychic. To me, this is just like a more mystical house in some ways. But creating a bit of a story, I think we're speaking more so now to... It's funny that we have more cards that would be in the past, although this does not at all have to be chronological. You can skip around and not feel like it's speaking in an order of events. So we have the 6 of Swords. To me, this is more of like a marriage of a more practical mind and a more intuitive spiritual mind, which fits in alignment for me with that 8th house. We get Death, so I guess this results in a more transformative experience. The 8th house, for me sometimes at least, does feel like it connects deeply with ideas of death, more metaphorical death than literal, but it's just interesting. And then we see a reoccurrence of this Knight of Swords, so this disruptive force might be a prevailing point. If you are somebody who believes in past lives and things, maybe karma. We get to the 4 of Wands, And this, I think, speaks to more of a stabilization, where maybe we're reaching a point where something pivotal is happening and there's a stabilization of a sort that results then in, we get the Six of Discs, which of course is more beneficial to us going forward, maybe a better relationship with the material world after having had this experience. And then we then see this Prince of Swords, and maybe this speaks to an evolution of us or another person entering the arena of our lives. So we're gonna, with that in mind, along the way you might want to write these down and things, but we've done that, so now we're ready to move on to what would be the third operation. I know this is a long video, so if you're still here, welcome aboard. And so for the third operation, further development of the question, shuffle, etc. as before, deal the card into 12 stacks for the 12 signs of the Zodiac, divine the proper stacks, and proceed as before. So we're doing the same thing again, but this time we're making 12 piles as the 12 Zodiacs. So depending on where we find our significator card, it's going to be relevant, at least based on what I find and how I see this to be. It would be relevant to the Zodiac sign it's present within, and this is meant to further develop the matter at hand. So we had found the significator in that pile of water, of the cups in marriage and relationships. Then we found it again in the 8th house. So taking that a step further, it's almost like a formula, and by the end we might say, okay, so we have the significator in this pile, and those were our findings in this area of life. We then found it in this house, so it speaks to this area of life. We found it in this Zodiac pile with these cards, and that speaks to the character of it and the way it might be characterized. So this is all getting more and more specific as we go, and that's the whole point, to keep that in mind. And hopefully by the end you'll have a very clear picture of whatever it is you're looking to know about. So while this process is a bit laborious and long, it is kind of fun, and I think you get a lot of interesting detail and insight out of this. So I will be back, I'll make our 12 piles, we'll find the significator again and get right into it. Alright, so we found our significator in the Aquarius pile. I went through and laid them out just as I did before. Of course, the same thing, if you're really trying to be like Crowley, applies, that you would have, I think, 2 chances to try to find the significator card. If you failed or weren't correct, then that would mean that maybe you're not in tune enough and you're not going about the reading properly, or you're not good enough, and then supposedly you would have to abandon the divination. But I just went through all the piles one by one. I didn't actually make guesses per se, but we found our significator in the Aquarius pile. So we're gonna round these cards up, make a little story, do some card counting as we did before. And so just laying these out like this is pretty simple and easy enough now. So we would have going 4 from our significator, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now we wind up back on the significator card. So because the significator card is automatically part of the reading and thus chosen, one could potentially assume, if you are counting the significator card, that this would be it. If you wanted to keep going and just were saying that the significator card was kind of exempt from being one that you could land on, then that would be what it is. Crowley doesn't exactly outline that in such a detailed way, so I guess we'll just keep going. Now we landed back on the Emperor, so it's going to just keep going back to the Emperor. I'm not the Emperor, the Knight of Wands, because if we land on him, do it again, we would land on him again, so he's going to be all that is in terms of this. And so I guess this is really getting to, maybe it's more deep and philosophical and profound than I realize, in that, you know, this being in the pile of Aquarius and it just being the significator card, it just speaks to me, apparently, and the idea of Aquarius as a sign being very relevant to this matter at hand, maybe an expansiveness, a need for thought, a progression, a need to socialize and get out. This feels very now karmic and broad and mystical in some ways, and this card just being the only card from that pile that is going to be relevant to this portion of the third operation is interesting. So that being said, you would keep that in mind, potentially write down your findings, speak to that card, and then proceed. Now we have the fourth operation. This is the second to last operation, and this would be shuffle, etc. as before, find the significator card, set him upon the table, let the 36 cards following form a ring around him. So this is actually speaking more so to the deacons, in that there's 36 deacons that create the wheel of the year, or all the Zodiac. And so instead of shuffling and cutting the deck, we would go through the entire deck, find the significator card, and then pick out the 36 cards that come after, create a ring or a circle, and then do the counting as we did before. So I will do that and be right back. Okay, so we went about that process. Let me tell you, 36 cards is more than you would think when you're trying to create a circle. I did end up making a bit of a spiral where there's multiple layers at play, so keep all of this in mind when you're doing this. It can get a bit confusing, very much aware of that. And one thing that I didn't mention thus far that you might want to do, just for the sake of time, this is already a long video, so I didn't mention this or get into this as much, but Crowley does have very interesting divinatory meanings for the majors right behind the portion that speaks to how to do a reading, and some of them are just so funny. Like, I will just read you one example, and we won't get too into this spot, but alright, so for example, the Sun card down here: give forth thy light, all without doubt, the clouds and shadows are no matter for thee, make speech and silence, energy and stillness, twin forms of thy play, glory, gain, riches, triumph, pleasure, frankness, truth, shamelessness, arrogance, vanity, manifestation, recovery from sickness, but sometimes sudden death. So we have a lot of contradiction here. You could have a recovery from sickness, but also a sudden death. You could have vanity and arrogance, but also glory, gain, riches, pleasure. So there's a lot going on within what these potential divinatory meanings could be. To me, I thought the funniest part was that it could be a recovery from a sickness, but also it could also mean a sudden death in a reading. So very interesting if you want to incorporate these for fun and see how they would play into a reading. But going as Crowley recommended, we laid out our cards as before, flip them over, create a bit of a story, see how this might pertain to the deacons. If you wanted to, you could even see which card in this layout pertained to what deacon of each sign, and you could put that into account. So I didn't actually do that and figure out, okay, well, this would be maybe like the second deacon of Aries, so on and so forth. I didn't figure that out, but you could go based on that and create your story with that in mind. Honestly, I think it would add a cool layer of depth. So we got the Seven of Cups, Two of Wands, then we have our significator card, the Three of Discs, we have Justice, or what would be adjustment in the Thoth deck, and then the Chariot. So we have maybe some, as far as the astrological deacons go, there's some illness going on over here, something a little bit less more unsavory. You get the Two of Wands, which feels like a way of breaking down maybe something that was an illness of a sort, or something, maybe an illness of the heart or mind, given that this is a more love, emotional, marriage-oriented reading according to Crowley. We get the Three of Discs, so clearly we're sorting things out. And then we get two majors, which to me feels like major events happening at a later stage after things have been sorted out, and that both of these are a lot more seemingly karmic and journey oriented rather than related to the minutia or the personal or relationship. They feel more substantial and like an undercurrent in a more event oriented rather than choice or emotion sense of that. I don't know how to explain that, but we're not going to get too into it. We're not going to make this a full reading because it's already a very long video. Now we've done that, you would write that down, find those findings, and then we have our fifth and final portion of the reading, the final operation, the fifth operation. Shuffle as before, deal into 10 packs to form the tree of life. Make up your mind about which where the significator should be as before, but failure does not here necessarily imply that divination has gone astray. Court and pair as before. So you would make 10 piles for the 10 sephira of the tree of life. If you're familiar with the Kabbalah and the tree of life, great. If not, you might want to brush up and see what each of the 10 sephira relate to in terms of the self and the universe and life, and then decide where you ought to find your significator card. If you make mistakes here, apparently it's okay, and so you would just continue looking until you found your significator. Do the same thing as before, basically, where you lay out the pile, count the cards to create a story, and then at this ending portion he says, Note that one cannot tell at what part of the divination the present time occurs. Usually operation 1 seems to indicate the past history of the question, but not always so. Experience will teach. Sometimes a new current of high help may show the moment of show the moment of consultation. I may add that the material matters. This method is extremely valuable. I've been able to work out the most complex problems in minute detail. It's quite impossible to obtain satisfactory results from this or any other system of divination unless art is perfectly required. So he says get used to divining, use the cards a lot, kind of incorporate them into your life for the best results. Now, he speaks to the idea that the first operation could harken to the past. Going forward, the actual operations themselves and what you find in them. So that whole first operation could be just all of the past. But he also says that that might not be the case. So to keep that in mind, but not necessarily take it for that in that way. So we're going to round the cards up, do our final bit of the reading where we make the piles that represent the tree of life, and then we'll wrap it up. Alright, so you can't quite see it based on this camera angle. This has been actually very difficult with the camera angles, but I actually made the piles into the tree of life. So if you look at the tree of life, it's structured in the same way. If you're familiar with it, then you will be able to kind of see how this went. So starting with 1, 2, 3, working our way down, and so we will find our significator card now. So we found our significator in the 5th pile, which is not, in my opinion, a favorable one to have found our significator, but that is what it is. And so we'll go ahead and count the cards based on this. If anybody knows the tree of life with the 5th pile of Jabura and how it correlates to Mars and is a more disruptive, aggressive Sephira on the tree of life, you'll know what I mean. It's probably, in my opinion, the least favorable to have found the significator. So we're going to get into that. Alright, so we laid out our pile, we did all of the counting as we do, and then we got our significator starting things off. So this could be seen as the present, the future, depending, or as Crowley said, it might not work chronologically at all. So we have our Knight of Wands, 10 of Cups, Ace of Cups, the Moon, then we have the Queen of Swords, the 3 of Swords, and the 2 of Cups. Now the way I've been doing this is based on where they are in the circle. That's how I create this. It's not the order that I landed on them. So I'm not sure if that's actually correct, but I have just taken the circle as it is once I'm done and started with the significator card, or started with where I started and kind of created and made the layout that way, instead of, say I landed, I think, on the Queen of Swords first. I could be wrong. I didn't make her the first card. I kept the circle intact and then basically just transposed it into a line where cards were picked out. So keep that in mind. I'm not sure if that's correct. If anybody out there is more familiar with this and is very knowledgeable on the operations, let me know. But then we have a lot of emotions. We have some fulfillment, all those types of things that you would associate over here, the Moon. So it does seem like the middle portion is the most nebulous and nefarious and foreboding, but that things will ultimately work out well, hopefully, with this 2 of Cups here. I mean, we started with that more cup-oriented pile. We have a lot of cups going on and watery energy in this final Sephira. We have the 5th disruptive Sephira that is where our significator was, so this might be disruption to come, but it seems very emotionally bountiful in a way, and that I think a lot of good things will come from the potential disruption that finding the significator here represents. So that's interesting. Now, that kind of concludes all of the operations. I'm not saying I did this perfectly or exactly as it was meant to be done at all, but I thought it would be fun to just walk through this, and for anybody who's not familiar with this, or the Thoth or Crowley or history of divination as it was maybe during these times, I thought it would just be a fun exercise. And if you were following along, writing down your results, all the better. I hope you got a great reading out of this. And yeah, if anybody out there is very, very well versed in these operations and the exact details of how it ought to be worked out, feel free to comment below if I've made mistakes or went about something incorrectly. There are a few areas where the lack of detail as to what to do did make me have to kind of guess. For example, was I supposed to put them in the order that I landed on them, which would create a very different order, or was I supposed to keep the circle or line intact and lay them out in that fashion? So let me know. I'm very curious. And yeah, I hope you are all well. Like and subscribe if this was fun and interesting for you. And let me know what you thought as well, of course. Until next time, bye.